June 14, 1952, 11:23 p.m. Bumpy Johnson stood outside the Stork Club on East 53rd Street in a custom-tailored gray suit that cost more than most people made in 3 months. A doorman named Patrick O'Brien was telling him he couldn't come inside. Patrick's face was red, not from embarrassment but from barely suppressed rage that a black man would even attempt to enter Manhattan's most exclusive nightclub. His hand was already moving toward the whistle he used to call police. Behind the velvet rope, white patrons in evening wear watched the confrontation with the kind of fascinated horror people reserve for car accidents. Bumpy's bodyguard, Illinois Gordon, stood 2 steps behind him, hand inside his jacket where everyone knew a gun lived, muscles tensed like a spring about to snap. The air was thick with gasoline from passing taxis and expensive perfume from women who'd stopped to watch. Patrick's voice got louder with each word. "I don't care who you are in Harlem. This is the Stork Club. We have standards and you need to leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." Then Bumpy did something nobody expected. Something so simple it seemed almost anticlimactic. He smiled, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small leather notebook. "What's your full name?" he asked pleasantly, like he was taking a dinner reservation. Patrick's hand froze on the whistle, because in that moment he realized he'd just made an enemy of someone who didn't need violence to destroy him. Bumpy Johnson wasn't at the Stork Club that night by accident. He'd been invited, which made the doorman's refusal even more significant. The invitation came from Meyer Lansky, one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. Lansky had been trying to arrange a meeting with Bumpy for weeks about coordinating operations between Jewish mob interests and Harlem's numbers racket. They'd negotiated through intermediaries, but Lansky wanted a face-to-face. He'd suggested the Stork Club, neutral territory, public enough to be safe, private enough to talk business. Bumpy knew it was a test. The Stork Club had an unofficial but rigidly enforced whites-only policy. Black celebrities occasionally got in. Josephine Baker had famously been refused service there in 1951, causing an international incident. But regular black patrons, even wealthy ones, were turned away at the door. Lansky suggesting they meet there was either ignorance or a deliberate provocation to see how Bumpy would handle discrimination. Some historians argue Bumpy should have refused the meeting location, that accepting it meant accepting the premise that white spaces had the right to exclude him. Others claim Bumpy saw an opportunity. If he could get inside the Stork Club, if he could force one of Manhattan's most segregated spaces to serve him, that would send a message about his power that went beyond Harlem. Either way, Bumpy showed up at 11:20 p.m. on June 14th, dressed impeccably, knowing he might be refused, knowing Meyer Lansky was already inside waiting. What Bumpy didn't know was that Patrick O'Brien, the head doorman, had been given explicit instructions by the club's owner, Sherman Billingsley. No exceptions to the policy tonight, no matter who asks. When Bumpy approached the door, Patrick didn't even let him speak. "Private club, members and invited guests only. You need to leave." "I am an invited guest," Bumpy replied calmly. "Meyer Lansky is expecting me." Patrick's face hardened. "I don't care who's expecting you. This club has standards. You're not getting in." The confrontation at the Stork Club's entrance lasted 4 minutes, and at least 30 people witnessed it unfold. Bumpy didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't move toward the door aggressively. He just stood there, perfectly calm, while Patrick O'Brien's explanations for why Bumpy couldn't enter became increasingly transparent in their racism. First it was members only, then it was dress code violations despite Bumpy's obviously expensive suit. Then it was we're at capacity even though people were still being admitted behind Bumpy. Illinois Gordon moved forward at one point and Patrick blew his whistle. 2 NYPD officers appeared within 30 seconds. The Stork Club always had police nearby, part of the arrangement between Billingsley and the department. The cops approached, hands on their nightsticks, already assuming Bumpy was the problem. "What's going on here?" the first cop asked Patrick. "This man is trespassing, won't leave when told," Patrick said. The cop turned to Bumpy. "You need to move along." "I have an invitation to meet someone inside," Bumpy explained. "I'm being refused entry based on my race, which violates New York's civil rights laws." His voice was steady, factual, like he was discussing the weather. The cop looked uncomfortable. New York had passed anti-discrimination laws in 1945, but enforcement was spotty at best, especially in places like the Stork Club. "Just go somewhere else. Plenty of clubs in the city." "But Meyer Lansky is waiting for me here," Bumpy said. And he said it loud enough that the crowd of onlookers could hear. That name, Meyer Lansky, changed the situation. Both cops recognized it. Patrick recognized it. Everyone knew Lansky was inside, knew he was connected, knew that refusing his guest might cause problems. Patrick's face went from red to pale. "I'll check with Mr. Billingsley," Patrick muttered, disappearing inside. While they waited, Bumpy pulled out his small leather notebook and started writing. Illinois leaned in and whispered, "Boss, what are you doing?" "Taking notes," Bumpy replied. "Patrick O'Brien, head doorman, officers." He looked at their badges. "Reynolds and McCarthy. All witnessed. All documented." Patrick O'Brien returned 3 minutes later with Sherman Billingsley, the Stork Club's owner and a man who'd built his empire on exclusivity and unwritten rules. Billingsley was blunt. "Mr. Johnson, I understand you have business with Mr. Lansky. However, this is a private establishment and we reserve the right to refuse service. I'd be happy to send Mr. Lansky out to meet you, or you could arrange to meet elsewhere. Your establishment serves the public and is therefore subject to New York's anti-discrimination statutes," Bumpy said, still calm. "Refusing me entry based on race is illegal. But I'm a reasonable man. Let me inside to meet Mr. Lansky as arranged, and we can forget this happened." Billingsley's jaw tightened. "I'm afraid that's not possible." "Then I'll file a complaint with the State Commission Against Discrimination tomorrow morning," Bumpy said. "I have witnesses, I have documentation, and I have Meyer Lansky inside who can confirm I was invited." He paused. "But more importantly, I'll make sure every black entertainer, every black athlete, every black person with money and influence knows that the Stork Club refused service to Bumpy Johnson. You think your business can survive losing Josephine Baker's crowd? Wait until you lose everybody." Some historians argue this was an empty threat, that the Stork Club's white clientele wouldn't care about black boycotts. Others point out that by 1952, black celebrities were becoming increasingly important to Manhattan's nightlife economy. Jazz musicians, athletes, entertainers, they brought crowds and attention. Alienating them meant alienating a growing market. Billingsley hesitated. He'd weathered the Josephine Baker incident, but that had been one person, one night. Bumpy was talking about sustained pressure, about turning his refusal into a cause, and Billingsley knew Bumpy had the connections to make it happen. "One drink," Billingsley finally said. "You meet with Lansky. You have your drink. You leave. And this doesn't happen again." "I'll leave when my business is finished," Bumpy replied. "Not before." Billingsley nodded to Patrick, who reluctantly unhooked the velvet rope. Bumpy Johnson walked into the Stork Club and the entire room seemed to pause. The club was packed. Wealthy white patrons in evening wear, celebrities, socialites, the kind of people who came to the Stork Club specifically because it was exclusive. And now Bumpy Johnson, a black man from Harlem, was walking through the main room like he owned it, following a nervous waiter to Meyer Lansky's table. Lansky stood when Bumpy arrived, extending his hand. "Mr. Johnson, I apologize for the confusion at the door." "No confusion," Bumpy replied, sitting down. Your doorman made himself very clear, but we're past that now. They talked business for 45 minutes, the coordination between Jewish mob operations and Harlem's numbers game, profit-sharing arrangements, territorial boundaries. Standard negotiations. But what made the meeting legendary wasn't what they'd discussed, it was everything else happening around them. Bumpy had ordered an expensive scotch. He drank it slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone in the club saw a black man being served at the Stork Club. People at nearby tables kept glancing over, whispering. Some looked angry, some looked curious, some looked uncomfortable, like they weren't sure what they were supposed to feel. Illinois Gordon stood near the bar, visible, present, making sure everyone knew Bumpy hadn't come alone. And Bumpy, for his part, acted like he'd been coming to the Stork Club his entire life. Relaxed, confident, unbothered by the stares. When the business was concluded, Lansky stood. Thank you for meeting me here. I hope next time we can arrange something more comfortable. This was comfortable enough, Bumpy said. Then he did something that became part of the legend. He ordered a second drink. Lansky raised an eyebrow. You're staying. Billingsley said I could stay until my business was finished, Bumpy replied. My business with you is finished. But I have other business now. Bumpy Johnson stayed at the Stork Club for 2 more hours, and what he did during that time became the story everyone told. He didn't cause trouble, didn't start confrontations. He just sat at that table drinking expensive scotch, occasionally taking notes in his leather notebook, watching the room. And slowly, something shifted. Other black patrons who'd been turned away at the door started being admitted. Not many, just a few, but enough to notice. A jazz musician Bumpy recognized, a black couple in evening wear. 3 people who worked in Harlem's entertainment industry. Some people claim Bumpy had arranged this in advance, that he'd told people to show up after he got inside to test whether the Stork Club would maintain its policy. Others say it was spontaneous. That word spread through Harlem's nightlife community that Bumpy had gotten into the Stork Club, and people decided to try their luck. Either way, by 1:30 a.m., there were 8 black patrons in the Stork Club. Not many in a room of 200, but 8 more than there'd ever been before. Billingsley watched from the bar, his expression unreadable. Patrick O'Brien looked like he wanted to disappear. At 1:45 a.m., Bumpy paid his tab, left a generous tip, and stood to leave. As he walked toward the exit, he stopped at Patrick O'Brien's station near the door. Your full name, Bumpy said again, was Patrick Michael O'Brien, correct? Patrick nodded, confused. Just making sure I have it right, Bumpy said. For my records. He smiled. Have a good evening. The real genius of what Bumpy did at the Stork Club became clear in the days that followed. On June 15th, Bumpy filed a formal complaint with the State Commission Against Discrimination, documenting his initial refusal at the door, naming Patrick O'Brien and Sherman Billingsley. The complaint included witness statements from the 2 police officers who'd been called, from several bystanders who'd seen the confrontation, and from Meyer Lansky, who confirmed Bumpy had been invited. But Bumpy didn't stop with the legal complaint. He did something more effective. He spread the story. By June 17th, every black newspaper in New York had covered it. The Amsterdam News ran it on the front page. Harlem's Bumpy Johnson breaks Stork Club color barrier. The story emphasized not just that Bumpy had gotten inside, but that he'd stayed, that he'd forced one of Manhattan's most segregated spaces to serve him, and that other black patrons had followed. The Stork Club faced a choice: fight the complaint and the negative publicity, or quietly change their policy. Billingsley chose the latter. On June 20th, the Stork Club issued a statement saying they'd always welcomed distinguished guests of all backgrounds, and that any confusion at the door on June 14th had been a misunderstanding by an overzealous employee. Patrick O'Brien was quietly transferred to a different position. Not fired, that would have been admission of wrongdoing, but moved where he couldn't control who entered the club. Some historians argue the Stork Club's policy didn't really change, that they continued discriminating more subtly for years. Others point to the fact that black celebrities and wealthy black patrons did start appearing there more frequently after June 1952. The truth is, probably both. The explicit barrier came down, but informal discrimination continued in other ways. What's undeniable is that Bumpy Johnson had forced a change by refusing to accept the refusal, by documenting everything, by using both legal channels and public pressure, and by turning his own entry into permission for others to follow. The Stork Club incident became legend not because Bumpy won a fight or outsmarted an enemy. It became legend because he proved power could work without violence. Everything Bumpy did that night was legal, public, documented. He didn't threaten Patrick O'Brien physically. He didn't intimidate Billingsley with mob connections. He didn't destroy property or cause scenes. He just refused to leave, insisted on his rights, documented the discrimination, and used the system against itself. Some people argue this undermines Bumpy's gangster reputation, that it makes him seem too respectable, too willing to work within structures that were designed to oppress him. But that misses the sophistication of what he did. Bumpy understood that different situations required different tools. Street conflicts required street solutions. But breaking segregation at the Stork Club required legal pressure, public attention, and strategic patience. The leather notebook he'd pulled out became part of the legend. People talked about how Bumpy had documented everything. Names, badge numbers, exact quotes. How he'd turned a racist doorman's refusal into a legal case. How he'd stayed calm while Patrick O'Brien got increasingly agitated. That control, that strategic thinking under pressure, that willingness to use non-violent methods when they'd be more effective, those were the lessons Harlem took from the story. Bumpy lived another 16 years after the Stork Club incident. He fought plenty of battles with violence and intimidation. But the Stork Club story remained one of the most frequently told because it showed a different side of his intelligence. It showed that Bumpy understood power wasn't just about who you could hurt, but about how you could use systems, publicity, and principles to achieve goals violence couldn't reach. Patrick O'Brien finished his career at the Stork Club in obscurity. Sherman Billingsley's club declined through the 1950s and closed in 1965. Whether Bumpy's actions contributed to that decline is debatable, but the fact that the Stork Club's segregation became a public issue in 1952 certainly didn't help their reputation in an increasingly integrated New York. The story of Bumpy Johnson at the Stork Club is about a doorman who thought he had power because he controlled a velvet rope, and a man who taught him that real power doesn't ask permission. It documents refusal and changes the rules. Bumpy didn't destroy Patrick O'Brien. He didn't need to. He just made sure everyone knew O'Brien's name, knew what O'Brien had done, and knew that refusing Bumpy Johnson had consequences that lasted longer than one night. Next week, we're covering the time in 1947 when Bumpy Johnson mediated a dispute between two Harlem churches and somehow got both pastors to apologize to each other. It's wilder than it sounds. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment. Do you think Bumpy should have forced his way in, or was documentation and legal pressure the smarter move? Let me know. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept no. Document everything and make your enemy explain their decisions in public.